Well, good morning and welcome to yet another GemCap Academy. And this morning we're having a little bit of a fireside chat, and it's all about capital raising in Asia, a market that we all know, or we think we know, but actually in reality there's a lot to learn. And today I'm delighted to welcome two experts in that region. We're joined by Philippa Allen from Compliance Asia and Simon Powell from Peak Capital. Let me start by asking Philippa, would you kindly introduce Compliance Asia and yourself and what you do?
Absolutely. I'm the founder of Compliance Asia, which I established in 2003, so it's our 20th anniversary this year. We're the oldest in terms of length of establishment and largest in terms of number of staff, countries that we cover, and we have offices in Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai and Japan, and staff of the compliance consulting firms in Asia Pacific.
Thank you. Simon, could I ask you to introduce yourself and Peak Capital?
Thank you. So I've been in Asia 28 years. We started Peak 18 years ago, or just over 18 years ago. And the concept behind it was there were a number of talented managers who didn't have representation and weren't correctly licensed to raise money in Asia. So that was the gambit behind Peak Capital and what we've been doing since the outset. I mean, working with names that the UK audience would know well, Thames River Capital, Nevsky from the early days, more recently Belgrave, and as markets have progressed, obviously we're doing a lot more private placement or within the private equity space. So progression from straight UCITS now to some private equity as well as hedge funds.
And I should add as well that Simon has been a client to Compliance Asia for a very long time. I think perhaps it's almost your inception, Simon.
Well, I knew a couple of the founders. That probably helped, yes.
Well, it sounds like we've all got a huge amount of experience, and probably as the oldest guy in the room, I've probably got just age on my side, as anything else. But when it comes to raising money in Asia, it's an interesting question from our point of view as GemCap, because we meet a lot of managers both in Europe and in the US in particular. Their first port of call often tends to be the UK and into Europe, and invariably US managers go, well, let's go and do Europe, and then it realizes 27 different countries with different borders, etc. When it comes to going into Asia, it seems to be that almost down the line. Are they missing something? Should they be going into Asia sooner than other markets? What's your thoughts? Simon, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think that they should definitely be looking at Asia. I think that the misconception with Asia is that you can carpet bag in and see people and raise money and then leave, and sort of forgetting all the compliance sides, or putting compliance aside. It is a regulated environment and you need to do it properly. I would also add that I think there's a genuine lead time in Asia that is probably comparable to other parts of Europe and is different from the US. The other side of, or the important thing to consider, is to segment the market into probably the largest side of the market, which is definitely more challenging to reach and needs a global approach, is the private banking market. If you actually want to get distribution via private banking, which has now become a global initiative rather than a regional initiative it was historically. But it's certainly rich, and we've seen phenomenal growth coming out of Asia in terms of assets under management, in anything through from UCITS to private equity. Anything you'd like to add to that as you've experienced people coming in, Philippa?
I do think there are a few misconceptions about Asia. I mean, it starts with the idea that Asia is this homogenous place, and each of the countries, in fact, needs quite a different approach, and there's different networks in each place that you need to tap into. So I think the marketing is an important. You need to consider where you think your strategy and your particular target client base is, so that you can determine where you're going to fit in.
Okay. I mean, could you give me some numbers around the growth of the market in Asia?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at sort of UCITS in 2011, they were around 200 billion. There's been a 13% growth rate in that, and in 22 it's sitting at 600 billion, and that's just in the UCITS side. So pretty phenomenal growth. I mean, outside that, obviously, you're looking at your UCITS as a focus.
Right, and I mean, the rules are slightly different in each place, but the fact is that the UCITS vehicle is the only vehicle that can really comprehensively be offered in Asia via a registration process. And sometimes it's via a distributor and other times it's not, but within Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea and Japan, you can have UCITS funds authorized. That's a competitive edge for a UCITS fund compared to a Cayman Island product or an AIF, which is obviously only available in the sort of institutional space and is usually done by private placement. So there are certain advantages to the use of structure in Asia.
Okay, that's good. That's good to know. It's interesting when, again, talking to overseas-based managers or UK-based managers. One of the things I think they look at a market. They as I was talking about Europe, they go into Europe, the whole of Europe. Is there a key market within Asia that they should start at?
I'll go first, and hopefully Philip will agree with me. I think that just from a starting point of view, to start Hong Kong and use the market from Hong Kong to do Singapore as well, is probably the easiest entry point. Obviously, being a regulated entity in Hong Kong and then authorizing the product in Singapore and servicing it from Hong Kong, it is a sort of a light, or can be a lighter touch, and less, or it's more difficult to do from Singapore back into, or it's impossible to Singapore back to Hong Kong without someone on the ground. So Hong Kong, Singapore is the starting point from where Pete look at it.
Okay.
I would agree. I think that there's some advantages if you're a UK or indeed European-based manager. I mean, the fact that English is the language of communication in both places certainly makes that initial entry easier. And I think it takes a little longer for firms that perhaps have not dabbled in Asia to get comfortable around the ways in which places like Northern Asian markets operate. They have their own quirks, and whilst not insurmountable, what we normally see is those are markets that are tackled when people have already got operations on the ground in Asia via people who are familiar with them. They're much more difficult to access on a unknown basis.
Right. And what are the key requirements for fund managers to register in the region? Philippa, what's the
right? I mean, it's a little bit roundabout, but basically, if you want to be onshore in Hong Kong, like Simon, or in Singapore, you do need to have a physical operation in that location.
You actually need boots on the ground. You
need boots on the ground, and it's quite substantial amounts of substance. It's not an undertaking that can be taken lightly. These aren't, they're not BCP officers, they're not back officers, they're not an office. You can achieve it with two people, but that is stretching it, because both the SSC and the MAS have strong views on what they feel constitutes sufficient substance, which is why marketing via other routes is easier.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Philippa, but just for clarity, for my benefit, but also our listener, are you talking actually a fund management business absolutely physically being in the region, or taking Simon's role as an introducer, distributor in the region? Would that suffice?
Yes, but that would suffice, but that's a somewhat. It is a relationship with your fund is being permitted to be distributed into that market, and Simon is taking responsibility for a lot of the regulatory overlay that applies, the sort of the responsibility of interfacing with the SFC, dealing with the maintenance of sufficient staff, dealing with acting as the representative of that fund, and so on.
Right.
And the capital and the capital adequacy you need to have a Type 1 license. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's covered by Peak Capital in this instance. Yeah.
So that's obviously why we're quite selective. I would say we're approached by a number of managers, but a lot of instances it just doesn't make sense to work with them if it's not necessarily they're bad actors, but they really have to fit the local criteria, because there's no point in onboarding someone if we can't raise money for them because of the sort of standstill costs of running peak capital or any licensed entity.
I think the other thing to stress too is that it's sort of a little more like the US model. So you can be licensed to be a fund manager, and that means you're actually making investment decisions on the ground in these locations. Or you have to be licensed as akin to a broker dealer or placement agent, which is a more burdensome license with, it does allow you to market, but it's more burdensome and it has higher capital requirements, and it has more filing requirements. You have a lot more oversight of your regulatory activities than if you're simply doing the investment management function out of Hong Kong or indeed Singapore. It's a very similar system.
Okay. And when it comes to the traditional promotion of a product, one of the things I always talk about is the pitch document, the pitch book. But I guess there's other elements of requirements that are required, which would be signed off by Simon, I presume. The marketing material that would be signed off by Pete.
Yeah, I mean, I think I should have stated earlier on that we only deal with professional investors. So there's obviously no retail element to this whatsoever. That's probably the stating the obvious.
Yes.
But
Yes.
Rewind for that bit. Yes.
Put that one at the beginning.
Yeah, we only deal with professional investors. Okay. So yeah, I mean, to be fair, that there has to be certain disclaimers, and within reason, I think that most of the European standards work for Asia. I mean, if you start putting weird and wonderful guarantees, and that it wouldn't work for us anyway. But the standard things that you would see in a UK pitch book or any form of presentation, we just have to add our disclaimer. So
I think it's perhaps even a little more complicated than that. I mean, there's two distinct routes that you're dealing with across Asia. So I can generalize a little bit. There is you have your fund registered for sale to the public, and that requires the local regulator to authorize them. So in Hong Kong, for example, if you choose to do that, you'll have a Hong Kong key fact statement. The documentation needs to be put into Chinese as well, to local Cantonese. You have a number of regulatory filings and approvals that are required. In certain types of fund structures, the SFC will impose additional investment restrictions on top of what exists in your country domicile. And so that's, the public offer is certainly available, but it comes with local regulatory obligations at the fund level. When you're dealing with the institutional and professional investors, they can also be high net worth professional investors, individuals, and other types of corporates, family offices, and so on. You are doing it via types of private placements. Each country has its own set of rules around private placements, but you still have to be very careful around the identification of the investors. And the thing about using a service like Peak Capital is that's actually their regulatory obligation on the ground in Hong Kong. So they're the ones who are having to figure out that these clients are properly qualified to be considered professional, and doing the sort of diligence on those investors. So in some respects, for a foreign manager that isn't ready to tackle the full world of retail distribution in Asia, that is it means that they're not starting their relationship with Asia in non-compliance.
So just to add to that, so if you're a US manager, can you fly in and fly out to the markets?
You can. It's harder depending on jurisdiction. And that, if you like, the heat map of Asia is really run by where's more likely to prosecute and where's the enforcement strongest. Hong Kong and Japan both take quite aggressive enforcement action for people who might move above the radar and stop, sort of doing it quietly. And even if you do, you really do need to be careful about the way that you approach people, because there's restrictions on solicitation. So you can't be seen to be actively soliciting from offshore. It triggers an offence in Hong Kong, and it does in other countries. And you need to be very, very clear on your marketing materials and so on about the nature of the offering, to whom it's being offered, and the type of suitable distribution network for it. And you don't want to come too often, because that obviously, raises your head more and more above the parapet.
Yeah, I only come to Hong Kong when it's the rugby sevens, so that's once a year is good enough for me. So it's the highlight of my calendar. But when it comes to the local market, Simon, and the whole region, who are the dominant players? What's the distribution channel, the landscape look like from your point?
Can I just go? I mean, it go back on the last point and make that if a manager visits and he then sees clients with a regulated entity, that is, and he's talking specifically more around the generals of the market, and then the salesperson is talking about the product, that is allowed. So it's not that you can't have visiting fund managers. I think that's probably encouraged, providing that it's via a regulated entity. I think is just the only part I would add on that.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. That is this kind of the chaperoning, and the fact that you're controlling the distribution, rather than it just is a straight up kind of, we're going to jump on a plane and fly to Asia because we've heard that there's some money there that we can tap into.
Yeah, I think local knowledge is key, though, isn't it? At the end of the day, you've got to know who you're talking to, which goes back to my point there, my question there, Simon, which is, who dominates the marketplace? What does the landscape look like as far as channels concerned?
I mean, if you're talking about players, I mean, it is all of the good and great managers who have their own operations. So whether it's the Fidelities, the BlackRocks, it's all of the usual suspects you would see. And obviously, as they've got local presence, they can market their products to professionals, and or they also usually have a retail presence as well. So I don't think this
about the landscape as the fund buyers who dominate, not
sure.
by name, but the
sure. No.
channels.
Well, I think as I mentioned, the private bank is still, or private banks are the largest buyer of product, and stats out of Hong Kong say that it's 70%, but whether it's 65 or 70, I think really depends on the type of market. So if you take Hong Kong, private banks are particularly important, family offices, and then we have something sort of which is usually spin out, or individuals who spin out of private banks and created external asset managers, which 9 times out of 10 have the backing of a family or have some high net worth behind it. So it's a large chunk of it is via the private banks, but there's also an equally large playing space in family offices, multifamily offices, and external asset managers. I think without question, there's financial advisors here, but as with the UK and other markets, a lot of them have gone down managed solutions or tied to particular asset managers. So it's not an area we focus on. It's a lot more focused on multifamily offices, family offices, and external asset managers.
Sounds like a quite sophisticated market, quite institutional rather than...
Yeah. Interestingly, I always, when I think of, people say, well, what about the institutions? With the hospital authority or jockey club. I think that versus parts of Europe, it's a lot smaller segment, because for the role that we play in offering product, one would have to be realistic. You've got Fidelity with however many salespeople, however many fund managers on the ground. Are they likely to deal with the jockey club and can have a manager at their desk within an hour? Are they going to deal with an intermediary such as me offering a different range of products? I think there's historically there's been a big focus on big branded names away from more boutique. I'd like to say that the smarter family offices really appreciate having sort of offerings that aren't on every bank platform. So there's definitely appetite for sort of boutique style managers.
Well,
there's a couple of points to make around that as well, and certainly people who may be looking at the the big institutions you're talking about there, I think there's a slight myth about the degree to which the large Asian sovereign wealth funds and their associated government entities outsource their investment management. They're big institutions now, and they have sophisticated investment teams themselves. So a lot of the mandates that used to be sitting outside with managers have been actually insourced back into them. So GIC over the years has reduced considerably the amount of money, for example, that it has fed out to foreign managers. So it is a sophisticated market. CIC invests a lot more itself now. The government pension fund in Japan, which of course is the biggest in the world, really only looks for value in certain areas that it feels that it can't do competently itself. That's, although I think there's a perception from the rest of the world that you can just fly over and meet these guys and get a mandate. That's not actually what's happening. You've got to be more nimble and know the market and be able to play in the space and know where the money's really coming from.
Okay, well, that leads nicely into my next question, which is really about the look and feel, the brand, the marketing, and we all know that your example there, Philippa, like just flying in and flying out, and hopefully you've got a ticket by the time you got back to your desk. That just doesn't happen. You've got to be there for a while and build a rapport. In fact, Simon and I were talking before the call about the good old days and how it's changed a little bit in recent times. But do you both feel that when it comes to pitch documents and marketing literature that has had to evolve and change? And what are the requirements now when it comes to getting not just in front of a manager, but in front of a fund buyer, but what you need to put in front of them? Are there differences these days?
Shall I chip in first, Philippa?
Please,
I think the one thing that that is very apparent in Asia, which I know that the US or Europe and the US struggle with, is turnaround times. So the rule of thumb, if you put a product in front of a client and you put a pitch book in front of them and they come back with a series of questions and say, I want a DDQ, I want answers to these 5 questions. If you can't get that back to them in 36 hours, they've moved on to a new product. So there's a real speed of turnaround that I don't believe is the same in other marketplaces. And that's something we sort of try or try early on in our communication with our counterparts. So if we're working with a manager, we say, look, we sort of need to work with some dedicated who's prepared to give us this information. Otherwise, I think that client will probably move on to another product. It's the attention span is somewhat shorter, I think, for unresponsive managers.
And Philippa, does the documentation have to be different depending on whether it's a public offering or private? Is there any distinction?
Yes, there's certainly differences if it's public or private. And in the public space, as I said, it's complicated with local requirements as to things like key fact statements, local prospectuses, translations of documents, approvals of advertising materials, or at least meeting advertising standards. It gets even more complicated if you're doing it in jurisdictions that have a mandatory requirement for translation of documents in the public space into sort of both official languages. And in the private space, I think Simon's right. There is a responsiveness demand in Asia that is very high. People work hard here, and it's we're not seeing people working 3-day weeks and so on. So there's sort of a feeling that, well, we're at our desks asking you for information. Why aren't you getting back to us? And I think there's a general slight disrespect of time zones in Asia as well. They're sort of frustrated if they're not getting an answer that night. And so I think there's some things that play into it in a fast-moving decision-making environment. The other thing I would say, though, is that there has been a tendency lately for the knowledge bases, the sophistication of the bigger investors, the sort of people that Simon's speaking about. They're much more sophisticated in knowing that there are rules around things that how performance is presented, for example. So we're seeing a lot of the people, the managers we work with, sort of standardizing their presentation of marketing materials in relation to performance, for example, often to the US standards, because there's so many specific rules there. They sort of figure they might as well reach that. And Here in Asia, you see a number of US managers who are also allocating. And so I think that also you've got to balance your presentation to make sure that you're capturing, all of the various players in the market.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, that leads on nicely to the mistakes that managers make and the challenges as a fund manager based in Europe, UK, or the US, going into a region like Asia. What do you think are the biggest challenges, Simon, from your point, as far as getting the message across in the region? What are the key issues?
I think consistency is key. So there's been a number of examples where managers have opened shop, or sort of done their roadshows, seen clients, and then markets have hit a tough time, and globally the head office has said, "Oh, we're going to cut Asia because of the cost of running it," and then they've left the market, and then when markets have bounced, they have a new person in head office, and he said, why aren't we operating in Asia? And I think that's a common mistake, dare I say it, with American houses, where they've come in, they've left, they've come back. And I think to come back is incredibly difficult, because people have memories and they say, oh, when you didn't you have an office here before? And then if you haven't stayed the course, I think that's challenging, or challenging to grow from that. When we work with managers, we're very keen that we have support from the manager on a regular basis, through the thick and the thin times. And I think this is a global phenomenon, is that fund managers love going out there when they're number one in the league tables, but when they're languishing, they're not quite so keen to sit in front of clients and be beaten. Whereas I think that's the important time when you need to have that manager support. So we're very keen to communicate that with the managers, that with this mandate we're signing, we need your support on a quarterly basis, or whatever the numbers are.
I think that's a global situation, Simon. I agree completely. Philippa, from your point of view, what mistakes do you see fund managers make?
Yeah, I think Simon's being a little modest actually about the sort of role that he plays, because the other thing that is, I cannot stress enough that you need people who know how this place works. They're putting you in front of the right people. They know who the decision makers are, because you could spend a lot of time as a manager meeting junior people who actually have no decision-making authority, and then you wonder why you're not getting mandates. You realize that you've not actually gone in at the right level, and it takes you a long time to build that and to know the depth of who you should be speaking to. And then on top of that, I think if there's something that, the complexity of Asia, it's not a continent. It's many different countries with many different ecosystems. And what might work in one place isn't passported magically into another place. So there's a lot of people who just don't do their research, and so they don't know that they're tripping up on rules, or presentation style, or the way that they're dealing with people from one culture as opposed to another culture.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Turning slightly to specific products now, if we may. 2022 was an interesting year in all asset classes, challenging for a lot of fund managers. Simon, from your point of view, what did you feel was hot in 2022, and what are your expectations for 2023? I don't expect a crystal ball here, and we may play this back in a year's time to find out whether or not you're right or wrong. But just for
sure. So I think there was a bigger push in sort of the private credit side, a sort of liquid or less liquid, and people were looking either to generate income or looking for capital appreciation over the longer term. What surprised me is that the number of people we've spoken to who had previously stated that they would never invest in a macro manager, during last year, all of a sudden they had large positions in macro managers. So it's whatever's hot. So I'd like to say that hopefully after last year, and people falling into the trap of just doing, bonds and equities, and that's split and sticking with it. People will go back to a more balanced view with having, whether it's a CTA or whether it's macro. We've tried to deal with this by looking at an uncorrelated asset, which is litigation finance, and that was really on the demand of clients saying to us, we want something uncorrelated. It will be interesting to see this year if they do actually want something that uncorrelated, or whether that was just the story last year. People always want it when it's happening, but post the event, then they'll that they turn around and say, well, equity markets look good value at the moment. So time will tell. But I think the winners we saw last year was in the private credit space, really.
So, Philippa, from your point of view, what's on your books for 2023? Managers lined up launching products?
We do. I mean, we're agnostic as to what people's strategy or funds are. We'll help people with any type of fund product. I dare say we even have one or two of our better established fund management companies who've got a crypto asset class. But there has been, alongside private credit, the private equity story in Asia has also been very big over the last few years. And it remains a very, very popular strategy. As alongside in the alternative space, the sort of macro guys, we are seeing more truly alternative kind of quant and algo type funds that are being launched here in Hong Kong, usually backed by Chinese portfolio managers who are very skilled in that area.
Okay, brilliant. Sticking with product, but more around the structures. Obviously, GemCount, we're a UCITS platform with the management company sitting in Dublin. When it comes to the structures, what are investors looking for? I mean, we touched on it briefly at the beginning of the conversation, but Philippa, do you want to just outline what investors are looking for, and then Simon, maybe you can talk about some working examples.
I mean, if you look across the market in Hong Kong, there's a variety of options. Obviously, I think even at this point in time, about 60% of all the retail funds that are sold in Hong Kong are UCITS funds. And Simon mentioned many of the very big names, but also domestic fund houses and PRC fund managers also have UCITS fund structures. So it's a very familiar product in this part of the world, and a conversation that is easy to have with investors. Likewise, in the institutional family office and high net worth individual space, the concept of alternative investment funds under the AFMD are also well-known structures. And so, people know that those are, or perhaps view them as the alternative equivalent to a UCITS. Many Cayman Island funds are distributed in Asia and in Hong Kong. And that's been primarily from the hedge funds and the private equity funds. And then you have local fund ranges that are starting to pop up. There's always been a need to have a certain percentage of local funds for pension fund investments. So if you're going to be, wanting to engage with a mandatory provident fund or the equivalent in other places, but increasingly there's a bit of a war going on in Asia between who's going to have the Asian vehicle that in 20 years' time will be like the Asian UCITS. So you have a series of different structures here in Hong Kong. And most recently, the Hong Kong Open-Ended Investment Company, and in Singapore, they've gone down the route of a VCC, a variable capital company, based on the Irish version of that.
All right, bit of plagiarism, was it?
It's an improvement, and actually, I've heard Irish lawyers admit that the one in Singapore is an improvement.
Oh, well, that's good. I might look myself.
Yeah.
Simon, can you add to that?
Look, I think Philip has covered all the bases, but I mean, UCITS are fully understood. I think that the slight difference of Asia is that they're a little bit more agnostic with regard to whether it's a UCITS or a Cayman. Without question, if you move further afield and it's a BVI, sometimes questions are asked, but it's mainly the UCITS structure or Caymans that I mainly come across.
Okay.
I would also say as well that there are concerns, and this may be a little controversial, but there are structural and other concerns about what success Hong Kong is going to have in becoming a choice fund domicile. So I don't think we're going to see UCITS funds being knocked off the shelf here anytime soon. There is some issues around, although they have made tax improvements to assist local fund domiciles, that won't work for all types of funds. And obviously, there are some uncertainties in Hong Kong about whether it's the ideal place to structure a fund. So I don't see it's similar to the debate that the offshore fund jurisdictions like the Cayman are going to be replaced completely by onshore funds. I don't think that's going to happen soon either.
Thank you for that. Let's finish by just doing a bit of a around the region sort of coverage. And Simon, maybe I ask you to just talk about the key markets. I mean, we've got Japan, we've got China, India, Singapore, Hong Kong. Do you want to just give us a quick view on each of those markets, putting yourself in the
with
position
a view to sort of how we could distribute in those markets?
Yeah, I'd be interested to know. Yeah.
Okay, well, we have facilities via a company that we have links with for Japan. So Japan is an incredibly slow burn, and the reality of experience of marketing in Japan since I've been here as it's become more difficult to market. So the only way to do it is with a local Japanese speaker assisting. Otherwise, I think you would be a lot older than me and a lot grayer than me before you'd written a ticket. So there's some local support needed there, and I believe we have a very good partner there. With regard to China, which is obviously the market that everyone wants to talk about, we've always sourced Chinese assets via Hong Kong. Maybe that's a dull and boring way of doing it. It's just the underlying managers we've dealt with have always been far happier with sort of the KYC and suitability and no sort of knockback from them if it's where the assets have come from China. And obviously a lot of those have come via private banks, or so there's a numerous sort of touch points from regulators to ensure that everything is as it should be. As I've said, we've gone the registered route into Singapore, so registered product in Singapore and focused on professional investors. And in Hong Kong, we've focused with our Type 1, so we have the ability to speak to all of the local players. Australia is slightly quirky, and again, I'm not going to compare it to Japan, but I think, and probably Philip can chip in here, I think that really for true success in Australia, you need a local on the ground. We have done some marketing there, and we've had licensing via Peak historically with ASIC, and it's something we do, but I believe partnership by having a decent resource on the ground is the way to go. It's a big marketplace, obviously, with the super side, and there are large tickets. It's reported as being more price sensitive than I actually believe it is, but you need a local product. So it's a little bit more complex than just carpet bagging in and leaving. So that I think I'd put into the Japan bucket. Okay. Outside that, places like Thailand have opened up to foreign investment more recently. I think they've caught a little bit of a cold last year, so definitely sales have have slowed into more of the UCITS products. But without question, there's certainly enough clients to speak to in Hong Kong and Singapore for us in the pro-tem.
I think as well that the tentacles work quite nicely in Asia. So, all of the private banks are equally as represented in Hong Kong and Singapore. And, that means that it doesn't really matter whether you touch point with them in either location, although typically, actually, the way it works is that more of the relationship management is done in Hong Kong, and much more of the booking center is in Singapore. And so even though you may think that you're limited to be dealing in the Hong Kong market, actually by positioning yourself to come into the Hong Kong market, you're really reaching into a much broader private banking network that operates around the region. And you don't necessarily need to fly to, Taiwan, for example, to meet people, because there's a lot of Taiwan money that's banked and served by relationship managers here, and likewise there's a lot of money from Southeast Asia that is also banked and managed from here. Maybe booked elsewhere, but the RM content is here.
Thank you. It's been a fascinating tour of Asia, a market that I love, a region I love big time. In fact, I spent some years living in Sabah, in Borneo, Kinabalu. I didn't mention that at all. But, so it's a region I love a lot. You've shared so much today, Simon, Phil. Thank you so much. It's much appreciated. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions which may come in. Between you, you've clearly got a huge amount of experience in the region. So hopefully our listener will reach out to you and contact you, and your details will be attached to this video. So thank you very much once again, and I'll wish you all a very good morning.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Speak soon.